Welcome all of the humanoids to today's video. Today is Friday. If you are not a humanoid, please go back to your planet. Or why are you watching a video if you are an animal? What we're looking over today is something cool, something good. Because in the last few days, we have gone through quite a few good things already. We have been documenting what has been happening for 9.1.5 and all of the positive changes. At least so far, we are at a hot streak of positive changes that we have been looking over for 9.1.5. So throughout all of this that was being announced, I thought, what about the good things that are already in the game? You know, amongst all of the complaints that the game keeps getting often for many things, one thing that generally doesn't get complained about very often is the raid. You know, when you talk about Blizzard doing this wrong, adding this activity which is bad, you hear complaints about island expeditions, about warfronts, about Torghast, about the Maw, even about Kortia. Yet, one of the things that is usually just chilling in a corner, immune to this type of complaints, every new tier or every new expansion, is the raid. Generally, the raids are always very high quality, they are enjoyed by the community. It is one of the crowning jewel of the game, the raiding scene. The raiding community is what drives many people to play the game as the ultimate type of activity, end game activity. So, what about this new raid? What about Sanctum of Domination compared to the previous raids? How it has been? How have the boss fights been? Has it been a better raid? Has it been a worse raid? Did something change compared to before? Etc, etc. So before we start rating this new raid, we have to talk about what happens inside the raid, or rather what Blizzard stuffed inside the raid, because it does happen very often that with the new raid, new powers, new power-ups are going to be put into the raid. For a long time, the power-ups in question were tier sets, right? That's where the power was coming from in a raid setting, getting the tier sets and the set bonuses from the raid. Then Blizzard got rid of them in Legion, and they started adding other things like Azerite armor. Azerite armor initially was basically only dropping in the raid, the higher item level version. Outside of the Mythic Zero Dungeons base Azerite armor, the rest was coming from the raids, or if you were very lucky, from the weekly cache. Before they put a vendor for Titan Residium out, that's how you got Azerite armor. Then you had benthic gear in the raid. Sure, at the very least, this time around, you could get the mana pearls and then buy the benthic gear, the benthic armor outside of the raid, but the bonus itself, the bonus itself was for the raid. So that's another power-up. In Shadowlands, we didn't really have any type of raid power-ups coming from Castonatria at all, like zero. We had no types of power-ups coming from there. We did, however, get one in Sanctum of Domination, which is the Shards of Domination. Let's just go ahead and say that the experiment failed. The system itself didn't really bring anything new, anything special, didn't really enhance your experience inside the raid. You only had the option of 3 set bonuses, so as a result, 3 of your shards were locked in whichever color of bonus you chose, red, blue or purple. And the only thing people will remember about this one is either one, how large and busy are the particle effects of the Chaos Bane all around your character, kind of annoying, and number 2, even more annoying, the fact that you had to find the armor, which was a hard thing in the first place, and then find the gems to even be able to get these set bonuses, and for some people this process took weeks. So not very good. Okay, we're not starting too well when we are going to look at the raid. What about the actual bosses though, and the actual presentation of the raid itself? So as usual, the raid looks great. The presentation, the art style, the theme and the setting is very, very nice. Of course, you are fighting the jailer. You have already seen most of this stuff in the Maw. You know, the architecture and the feel around the Mawsworn is something we have been seeing already for a while. At least now we see their actual stronghold. And it was nice, it was good, very high quality. I still think overall the setting of Castonatria was better, mostly because I just enjoy that Venthyr architecture more than the Mawsworn one, but that might just be, it might just be preference. It's not necessarily true for everyone. What about the bosses themselves? So we start with the joke. At the very least, this time Blizzard actually made it a joke, which was the Taragru. You know, the first loot piñata boss. There you go. Now you can get in and kill the first boss, and it's just very, very simple. What about the actual bosses, not the jokes? The first boss, the first real boss, was Eye of the Jailer. The fight itself was pretty good. The fight itself was nice. You had a initial part of cleave with the boss and the add, and then you had the split phase with this sort of dual split raid on the two adds, and then converge back again for the boss itself. The last phase was also pretty cool. This is something we had been losing for a while, the idea of making a very high tension, a very high risk and tough last phase, because in the case of Eye of the Jailer, you were basically going to die. The eye was going to prevent you from being healed more and more and more and more until you were basically unhealable, so it was a race against time. It was a pretty good fight. The same cannot be said, however, for the third boss overall of the raid, which was the 9. I think the 9 was way too bloated. I think when your third boss in the raid has more abilities than Sylvanas, it starts to become kind of a problem. The entire encounter was kind of cool in the things you had to do. I think that the dispelling of the fragments was nice, having to spread for the soaks, and then both the suck-in, where you have to stay inside of the circle, and the run away, where you have to run outside of the circle, was cool. However, we had an extra bunch, half a dozen of mechanics you had to deal with, which sort of made the entire encounter more cluttered, especially when the stakes are not that high. It's just a third boss. Most of the mechanics were very forgivable. It wasn't a do a mistake once and wipe the raid type of deal, so you would see all of these mechanics flying around while not really being that threatening. So I think it would have been better if they purged a whole bunch of the mechanics in the fight and they made the currently harder mechanics even harder, to put even more emphasis on those without having to clutter the entire encounter with a multitude of mechanics to deal with. So I think they kind of missed the mark on the 9 as a fight, as a whole. Then, after the first 3 bosses, we go into the middle of the pack, which was a very solid, very strong middle of the pack, which was Ner'zhul, Soulrender, and Painsmith. Ner'zhul at the start was pretty tough. It required a lot of healing, and it started showing why damage reduction is so valued in raid encounters, why so many guilds, most guilds actually, are going for Restoration Shamans, Discipline Priests, and Holy Paladins, because you have abilities like Shatter. The first Shatter, a Mistweaver Monk is going to be fine with. However, the second and third Shatter, if you don't have a damage reduction on you, you're going to get one shot. And Revival is not going to help you with that, Tranquility is not going to help you with that, and Holy Word Salvation is not going to help you with that. What's going to help you with that? Barrier, or Spirit Link, or a Mastery with Devotion Aura. So that was the first fight, which highlighted the healer difference. The DPS as a fight was kind of okay. Mostly single target, some cleave, some padding on the orbs. Orbs which had to be true. The orbs had been nerfed by a lot, like 60% of their HP was nerfed, but the fight in general was cool. The whole positioning with the Malevolence for the blow-up was pretty nice, was a pretty nice mechanic to deal with. And the fight also had, you know, the later stages of the fight becoming more hectic and becoming more tense because of the last phase, the last part of the encounter, so it was pretty nice. Especially because it doesn't feel too bad if you start wiping at the end of the encounter, because the last phase is the harder, if the boss lasts for like 5 minutes or 6 minutes. You only start feeling bad if the hardest part of the boss is at the end and the boss lasts for 14 minutes. That's gonna feel real bad if you have to constantly wipe 12 minutes in, but for Ner'zhul it wasn't the case. Now, for a completely different boss fight, however, you have Soulrender. Soulrender, on the other hand, basically didn't have phases. They had repeatable phase 1, phase 2 situations. Phase 1, he's alive, the adds are spawning, and then the chains are gonna come. Phase 2, you have the dance. You have to run around and basically get to do free damage on the boss or on the adds if they're still alive. Another fight where damage reduction for healers is going to pay off a lot because of the chains breaking, being very good for damage reduction. Also a much better fight for DPS players because they get to do their AoE, they get to pad on the adds, and they never had to stop DPS, they can constantly do damage, so it's definitely better for them. It is also nice because the fight does call for something more than just brainless damage, because you also have to manage the adds. You have to use CC, smart CC in how to deal with the add and the main add you want to kill first, and then group them all together, and then AoE, so it was pretty nice on that end. And then you reach the last one of the middle of the pack, which was Painsmith. Painsmith was definitely the guild killer at the middle of the raid of this tier, next to basically Council of Blood of Castelnatria. The only difference is that while the intermission of Council of Blood was very well welcomed and very nice and very enjoyed by everyone, by the DPS and the healers alike, because they got to wait as their cooldowns were coming back throughout the intermission, plus the healers were also getting their mana back. The intermission for Painsmith was definitely not enjoyed as much, because it's basically where the majority of the players are going to die in the encounter, the intermission. The intermission is also pretty much a standalone thing. It's not even WoW. It's a platformer bullet hell minigame. You have to dodge, skip, jump, go back, stand still, go forward. It's just very, very unique compared to the normal things you would be doing in an encounter. The fight itself is pretty cool. You have to deal again with this system where the deeper you go into the boss, the harder it becomes, because first the spikes generated by the tank being thrown the weapon of Painsmith are stationary, and then in phase 2 they start moving, and then in phase 3 they start moving, and you even have less room to dodge them as they spawn, so it becomes harder and harder while not being, you know, oppressively hard. Talking about not being oppressively hard, we have to skip Phase Scribe to go and talk about Guardian of the first ones, because this, I can say, is the first and only completely botched fight of the tier. You can see what Blizzard was trying to do with Guardian. They were trying to somewhat replicate what Sludge Fist was for Castelnatria. This, you know, big, fat, stationary boss fight that does nothing. It's basically just a single target dummy that you get to slam. And it didn't pan out to be as nice and as smooth in terms of balancing and in terms of the fight, how it worked, as Sludge Fist was for Castelnatria. And it's not that Sludge Fist was this, you know, this insane fight. It's very difficult to make a super good fight if it's that simple, if it's just a single target DPS check. But for Guardian, it was just too simple. It had been dumbed down from the PTR to live, so your choices on when to trigger or how many purification protocols you wanted to trigger, for example, was basically stripped from you. Now it was always the same in the live version, which, you know, took away a lot of possible ideas, possible avenues of strategy that you could use on the boss itself, so it became just very, very simple. Definitely the least successful of the bosses when it comes to balancing and when it comes to the actual mechanics of the fight. Going back, however, to a pretty good one, it's Phase Scribe. Phase Scribe was very good. The intermission of Phase Scribe was definitely better than the intermission of Painsmith. I'm sure people will still dislike it, many people will, because it is not, again, it is not real WoW, so to speak. You have to do something very unique, which you will only be doing in this fight ever, which is the matching of the runes with their socket, but it was definitely better than Painsmith. Painsmith, you know, some mistakes on Painsmith were just unavoidable, or perhaps just very, very difficult to avoid. Sometimes you were punished if you were too slow of a spec, for example. It kind of felt bad sometimes if you died, whereas on Phase Scribe, if you died, almost always it was your fault. It was you messing something up. Getting hit by the laser, getting hit by the tether, getting hit by the balls, you know, it was mostly just your fault. Which is better for players, to be able to not die because they are doing the fight properly, whereas for Painsmith, you know, sure, there was some leeway for some mistakes. So I do think the fight was very well done when it comes to Phase Scribe. Then we have KT. Kel'Thuzad was also a very good fight. However, it has been somewhat dampened by the way the players decided to play the fight. So Blizzard doesn't get as much of a flack on this one like they got for Guardian. The whole idea, if you haven't done Kel'Thuzad, is that the hardest part of the fight is to deal with the glacial spikes. The glacial spikes are so dangerous that what you do with them is that you dump all of your healing cooldowns at the same time. What happens then if Kel'Thuzad reappears again after you transition in the intermission and he casts the spikes again and your healing cooldowns are not back? Because as we said, you just used them all the first time the spikes happened. Well, you die if you don't have the cooldowns. So the entire strategy of KT was to delay the intermission to make sure that by the time Kel'Thuzad would reappear, your healing cooldowns would be back for the next spikes. So the fight became a very delayed fight where DPS had to roll their thumbs for almost 3 minutes throughout the entire fight. So it makes it look like a very weird fight like a very question mark, what is going on type of fight. And this is due to a problem we are about to discuss, but only after we go through the last boss, Sylvanas. In my opinion, Sylvanas is the best of the last bosses of the recent expansions. Looking through bosses like Denatrius, like N'Zoth, like Jaina, even like Uhunat in the middle, and Gahun, I think this is the best one we have gotten so far. The only negative, which is also going to be the negative of many people, is that the fight is 14 minutes long. It is very tough, you know, it is very tough to wipe 10 minutes in, 11 minutes in, 12 minutes in, because it takes a long time to get there, and then when you wipe and you start again, you have to go through 10 minutes, where you could also wipe and feel even worse, because if you wipe 4 minutes in, you know that you had 10 minutes more to go through if the fight wanted to end. So that's the only negative. The fight is great. Individually, the 3 phases of the fight, phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3, are all great. It's just that when you put them together, it becomes very, very, very long, you know, quite daunting to go through. I think it's great because there are many different things you have to do. If you're a DPS, you know, we talked about what you do, for example, on Guardian, which is a pure single target, or Kel'Thuzad, which is pure single target when it matters, and then some Mongoloid AoE when you want to deal with the adds. Fate Scribe is also pure single target, except for when you're cleaving down all of the adds or the couple of adds in the intermission, whereas Sylvanas, you have single target in phase 1, plus AoE on the chains in phase 1, you have single target in phase 2 on the big guy, and then cleave and AoE on the rest of the adds, with some priority targeting on the more dangerous adds like the Summoner and the Soul Judge, and then in the last phase you go back to pure single target. Not only there is a wide variety of types of damage you want, there is also a wide variety of things, because you have to use movement speeds. Very, very often it becomes very, very important. You have to use dispels, which is also extremely important in both phase 2 and phase 3. You have to use crowd control. You have to use interrupts, stuns, you have to use any kind of CC you can use in phase 2. So there is a wide array of tools you have to use in the encounter. If you compare this to something like Guardian of the first ones, it's pretty hilarious to look at the difference. It also, again, becomes very good from a healer perspective. Once again, you get to manage your mana. You get to deal with the possible issue of going out of mana. Granted, as a shaman, my thing was looking at other healers' mana bars and laughing at them, but for the other healers, not being a shaman, it can also be pretty stimulating having to manage your mana and being able to go through the fight not completely out, which is not something that, you know, nowadays is not something that happens often. Mana problems for many specs. So when we look at the entire raid, the thing that is pretty obvious at the end of it is how Blizzard has changed the way they want to make the bosses work. Previously, the toughest thing that could happen in a boss fight was the so-called bad overlap. You have mechanics that happen every 20 seconds, every 30, every 60, every 90, and every 2 minutes. And eventually, by the end of the fight, there would be this kind of solar eclipse where all of these cooldowns would converge together and create a very bad overlap. This was designed, for example, when the boss would transition to the last phase or transition to the second phase, it would reset its cooldown and make them in a way that they would overlap badly, so you have to deal with multiples of them that you had to deal singularly throughout the fight. Now happening at the same time, you have fights like Zymox, Artificial Zymox in Castronatria, that had bad overlaps at the end. You had fights like Council of Blood with bad overlaps, you had fights like Stone Legion with multiple bad overlaps, and Denatrius as well in the last phase with bad overlaps. In this tier, Blizzard basically removed most of these things, most of these bad overlaps. In return, what they did is they made the bosses transition or trigger certain abilities based on their health. This has created another problem, however, which is the dreaded, this is very triggering for DPS players, the dreaded phrase of your raid leader, stop DPS. Because the bosses are going to trigger certain abilities on HP level, it means you, the raid, gets to decide when that happens. So, if the boss triggers, for example, Shatter at 30% HP, and you're at 31% and Malevolence is about to be cast, you absolutely do not want to have Malevolence and Shatter happen at the same time. So you're gonna have to stop DPS for 20 seconds after Malevolence has been cast, after the healers had time to heal everyone back up, to bring him to 30 and make him trigger the Shatter. And this is sort of a prominent thing in this new raid, because Ner'zhul had this kind of holding DPS, Painsmith, when he transitions, had this type of holding the DPS, Fatescribe, when he transitions. You don't want to transition Fatescribe right as he's spawning an ad. You don't want an ad in the intermission, Kel'Thuzad. As we mentioned, why does it get spread for so much? Is because you want to delay when he transitions, when he goes into a different phase because of your healer cooldowns. And then Sylvanas, you want to delay her phasing in phase 1, and you want to get the two groups split into the two platforms to get to Sylvanas at the same time. So one of the two groups, whoever is faster, might want to stop the DPS. So there are different thoughts for this. Some people are happy about this because it means they get their cooldowns back more often. You know, the more you stop DPS, the more you have time for your big cooldowns to come back, as well as the extra for healers, which means they get their mana back. And then there are other people who don't like it because it means their HPS or their DPS is going to be lowered over time. You know, if you have to stop as a DPS for 40 seconds, rolling your thumb on Kel'Thuzad, your DPS is going to go low. So that's something that many people won't like as a result. This is kind of more up to preference, however. You might like it more as it is now, you might have preferred more the whole bad overlap we had, but however, if we were to look at the raid as a whole, I do think, again, no surprise, I said it might have happened at the start of the video, maybe it wasn't going to be the case for this raid tier, but not really. The raid is another very high quality raid in a very long list of very high quality raids. I do think, and this is where we go a little bit more into the personal preference, I do think that this is one of the better raids, and it's also better than Castornatria, while Castornatria is still very high quality itself. I think Castornatria is on the 9 out of 10, while Sanctum is probably 9+. It's one of my overall favorite raids of recent years, at the very least, recent expansions. I would also like to point out, as we close, how well balanced it has been. Remember that the main course of balance tuning that happened in Sanctum of Domination has been almost 2 months ago, and that was a nerf to Soul Render, a slight nerf to Painsmith, the nerf of the orbs to Ner'zhul, and some timing changes to Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas when they transition. That is a very, very low amount of balancing that has happened in the last almost 2.5 months. Very, very little, which means the fights themselves were pretty well balanced to begin with, if they did not receive that many changes over time. So that's also a pretty good positive for the raid. Now that we have done with my opinion, let me guys know what you think about the raid, whether or not you have done this in normal, in mythic, or in the middle, in heroic. How has it looked for you from your perspective? Thank you as always for watching the video. If you enjoy this type of content and you want to support the channel, you might want to raid a little bit more. That would be cool. Otherwise, leave a like on the video, leave a comment down below, and ask your kindergarten teacher if you can subscribe to the channel. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, Sanctum is one of my favorites, yes, but Nighthold is still ahead.